Hi, I'm Elizabeth Emery from Hear Her Sports, and I'm here with Cherie Turner of Strides Forward. And we are starting a new video series called Cherie and Elizabeth Talk Sports, and we're super excited. So, Cherie, how are you doing this week?
I'm doing really well, Elizabeth. And since we're here to talk about women in sports and media around women in sports, I will bring up something that I have been thinking about over the last few days. It's really stuck with me. I was reading Lindsay Gibbs' PowerPlays newsletter, and for anybody who isn't familiar with it, it's a newsletter about sexism in sports. So if you're watching this, it is probably something you want to subscribe to. She is a fantastic writer. She always has really interesting things to talk about. And her most recent newsletter was she talked to three sports reporters who break news for the WNBA or about the WNBA on Twitter. And one of those people was Howard Megdal. I hope I'm saying his name right. And there was something that he said that really stuck with me. And so I'm just going to read a little bit from the newsletter. He's talking about back in 2015, so it was a few years ago. He was covering both the World Series and also the WNBA playoffs. And he, first of all, noticed when he went to talk to the MLB players that there are hordes of reporters. He goes in to talk to one of the stars of the WNBA, Tamika Catchings, and there's almost nobody else there. And he says, he went to interview Catchings, and it was just him and a couple of videographers from the league. And he says, I wrote a story about what was one of the greatest Tamika Catchings performances there ever was. He goes on to explain, I take no pleasure in saying this, but if I hadn't been there, no one would have really documented it. I came home that night and remember just saying to myself, if the greatest player in the history of the league, winning in the world's most famous arena, Madison Square Gardens, is not getting coverage, how many other stories are falling through the cracks?
Wow.
And that sort of sums up uh why it is so important to talk about women in sports, because it's not that those moments aren't there. It's that if you don't talk about them, nobody knows about them and they don't know how great women's sports is.
Right.
And it's very sad, but also so much opportunity. And that's something I think about all the time. I'm always marveled by how many great stories I come across and I'm like, why didn't anybody cover this? And it's like, well, because only 4% of mainstream sports media goes to women.
Right, right. That's so
So,
fascinating. It's so
yeah.
wonderful that he talked about that and sort of memorialized that moment and also talked about memorializing that moment.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
things are changing, but there's still a long way to go.
Yeah.
And
That's why we're
yeah,
here.
that is why we're here.
Yep.
Exactly. So,
Yep.
what's going on with you? You have very exciting news.
Yes, well, if anybody's been following Hear Her Sports or me personally on social media, you know that I was at Cyclocross World Championships, which were in the US this year in Fayetteville, Arkansas. The last time it was in the US was in 2013, I think, in Louisville, Kentucky. And what an event! It was just so exciting, so awesome. It was amazing to see how incredibly fast they all ride. I mean, even the juniors, the junior women and the junior men who are under 18 were just smoking the course. And it was a fast course, but so fast. And every race was super exciting and fast. And the TV just doesn't do it justice how fast they go and how good they are at riding. And then the other thing, it was exciting to see the gender equity in the sport. You know, they all the races happened on Saturday and Sunday, and each day had three events, and they mixed them up. So on Saturday it was junior women, then under 23 men, and then elite women, and it was sort of the reverse on Sunday. And from my perspective, there was equal excitement, equal attendance, equal cheering for all the genders, and I really appreciated that. And then finally, on a personal note, I did a lousy job of hydrating,
Oh,
which I thought was so hilarious because, as you and I have discussed, I've been really working hard on hydrating properly during my own training in cross country skiing. So anyway, those are my little takeaways.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's so exciting. And yeah, it's I know the TV coverage has been improving dramatically with the cyclocross races, and you've talked a lot about it on your podcast. But it's exciting to hear that you saw that in action
Yeah,
and
exactly.
that on the ground the experience was very similar. So that's really exciting because of course we love to celebrate when people are doing it right because we need models to follow.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah. And so following that, the episode that we're going to talk about today a little bit or just touch on is the episode with Helen Wyman on Hear Her Sports. And I brought Helen on to the podcast because I wanted to talk to her about all the work that she's done in cyclocross. She is a British cyclocross superstar. Her results have been fantastic. She's now retired. And she was also on the UCI commission for, I think, 4 years. And she worked so hard to get gender equity. But what was so exciting to talk to her about in the podcast is very specifically a small, tiny change. And as she says, a free change that she made. But what's interesting, and what she did was she required or pushed to get the women's race to happen right before the men's race. And as she said, free, easy, and just the cascade impact of that was just tremendous. But it took her, and it took her intelligence and her foresight to see that that change would have such impact to make it happen. She also had to push for years for it to happen, which, like in retrospect, just seems ridiculous.
Yeah.
So easy. But, so that happened. I don't know. I can't even remember when that happened, but, like 6 years ago or something. And it's really made a huge difference in the coverage.
Well, and I know some of the things that you guys talked about because I love that episode. And there were a few things that really stood out to me. One was that they have really good coverage of the women's races, that it's not just some people who are there to commentate on the men and then just get left commentating on the women too. It's like people who are very engaged, they know about the writers, they know how to talk about them in exciting ways, and really get the fans interested in this race and then also in the men's race. It's not like the women are just kind of there doing their thing and then what we're really waiting for is the men.
Right.
Like they cover them both very, very well. Um and also that they discovered that people were started watching the women's races, and as is pointed out in the podcast, some of the viewership for the women actually exceeded some of the viewership for
Right.
the men, but was very often, it was very consistently, they were getting great viewership for both. So yeah, I mean, once again, another example of if you provide good coverage and you do it at a time when people are going to be watching, because oftentimes we see with women's sports that the women do their sport, their competition or their game or their race or what have you, at a time that's very separate and often inconvenient for people to watch. And then the men's races or games are held at a time when everybody's ready to sit down and
Right.
watch something. So by putting them together, having them at a good time, having great coverage, having great filming, they found that, oh, lo and behold, people are actually really interested. And I know you guys also mentioned that it was a great win for sponsors.
Yes. So
So
important. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. So sort of the whole package comes together, right?
Right.
Where it's not just one thing. And it's had the other thing I didn't realize is what an impact it's had on the sport
Mm.
from the development side.
Right. And financially for the female riders too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
That was.
younger.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That was super interesting. And you know what? Going back to the coverage a little bit, one thing that I've noticed, at least in this year and also maybe a little bit of last year, is because the commentators are on the men's race and the women's race, they get to sort of talk back and forth about, like, oh, this rider is like that male rider, and that male rider is like that female rider. Where I think in the past, female riders have always been compared to the male riders. And, there's the superstar Mariana Voss, And they often compare a lot of the male riders to Marianne Vos. So, that's really exciting because it doesn't set up the male as, the epitome or the standard or the
Right.
default, which I think is a problem that we see in coverage of women's sports.
I would agree with you. I would
Yeah.
agree with you. Yeah. Yeah.
So one of the things that we're going to be doing on these video series is talking about sports media, which we've obviously done already, but we are going to talk about an article today, and I'm trying to find what it's called, but it was in the conversation, and it was called Women's Sports is on the Way Up, but more needs to be done to secure its future. And one of the things that struck me in that article, which is a really great article, everybody should read that article. We'll, link it into the notes below. But one of the things that struck me about that was how oftentimes it's a men's organization, a male organization, that is in charge of the women's version of that. And, the WNB or the NCAA is having trouble with that right now. You can read about all that. But I recently spoke to Iris Slappendell, who is one of the founders and now the executive director of the Cyclists Alliance, which is a riders union for women road riders. And we were talking about the Tour de France, the women's version. And it will happen in 2022 in the first time for a long time. Last year it was a one-day event. So this year it's going to be, I think it's 5 days. So we were talking about, is it a good event? Is it like the tour? Is it enough? Et cetera, et cetera. But one of the things that came up is maybe we shouldn't have the Tour de France. Maybe we should have a very special women's event that's not associated with the ASO, which is the organization that runs the Tour de France, because it's super male. The UCI, the federation, the International Federation of Cycling, is super male. So maybe it'd be better to do our own thing. However, another thing that came up in our conversation was the Tour de France is sort of the highest level of cycling. And so when you talk about cycling, road cycling, that's what comes up, and people know that. And so there's something special about being able to have a women's version of that, because the women are able to say, I've done the Tour de France. And I cannot tell you how many people, other than asking me if I've been to the Olympics, they say, have you done the tour? And I'm always really happy to be able to say, yes, I have. And immediately they understand what I do or what I did.
Right.
And I think that's super important.
Yeah. Yeah. Having those cultural markers,
Correct.
right,
Yeah.
is just the reality. And you can back up and trying to explain something to somebody, but it's not going to resonate in the same way. Like if you said, well, actually, we don't do the tour, but we do this other event and it's great. They're already thinking about something else, right?
It
So
also sounds
having
like an excuse to me.
yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it is tough because inevitably the women are going to get compared to the men. People are going to see that the event is shorter, so that lends a certain perception.
Correct.
Yeah, and it's just something we're going to have to work through
Yeah. It
over time.
Yeah. And it's interesting, in the episode that just launched today of the Hear Her Sports podcast is with Cynthia Apia, who is a bobsledder now at the Olympics in Beijing. And she is a 2-man pilot, and she is a monobob racer. And so she and I also talked about the same thing. And the women had wanted the 4-man bobsleigh to be part of the Olympics instead of the monobob, which is a 1-person. And she said the same thing. The 4-person is what she called the Blue Star event, and
Right.
people know that. They don't know the monobob as well.
Right. Right.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
What did you take away from that article?
Well, one of the things I took away from that article is a propensity that I have myself so the article is all about like things are going well, but there's still more to be done. And I think something that happens is that we see some success, it's exciting, and then everybody just sort of takes a deep breath and we sort of stop there, where it's like, oh no, this momentum needs to keep going. Like there's still a lot of work to be done. And one of the takeaways that I had, in addition to, I did take note of, the fact that men are running these organizations that are for women in sports. And one of the things it said in there, just to comment on that specific element, is that the men don't know the women's game, and they don't know, like, there's this perception of just like, well, I know, I'm just going to say, for example, basketball or rugby. It could be anything. I know that on the men's side, therefore I am qualified to lead all people in that sport. And that's just not the case. They are different, and I think that it's really important to understand that, like, the play is different, the players are different. They're different things. You have to know about the specifics of the games that you're talking about and the people that you're talking about. So there is that. There was also something brought up about the lack of women journalists in media, in sports media, and how that needs to change. One of the a statistic I happened to grab recently from Lindsay Gibbs' PowerPlays is that she points out that only 13% of sports journalists are women.
Wow.
That is, I'm guessing that that's a US statistic, but we can extrapolate that, it's not that great
Hmm.
worldwide. And the thing is that, first of all, women aren't 100% responsible for just talking about women. So of those, say, 13% here, not all of them are talking about women's sports. And likewise, there are men that talk about women's sports too. But there has been this general sense that women journalists in sports do have an interest in talking more about women in sports. And so that's really important, to get women into all facets of women's sports, on the journalism side, and also not just as journalists, but as the editors, as the people higher up in media publications who make these big decisions about what's covered, who's covering it, how it's covered. I mean, it's a whole other element of sport, which is full of opportunity, but it also requires people to learn something new, or to let other people into the space that know more about it than the people who've been there for a really long time.
I was going to say
So,
that. I mean, it's great to have women journalists, but if they approach their editor with a story for about women's sports, then the editor is like, "Oh, no one's interested in that because he's a
right,
guy and doesn't know, or and it's not been done, or whatever reason." That doesn't help. We need more women at the top making the decisions.
right. And I have often personally been critical of outlets like ESPN or Sports Illustrated, because, like, they say that they're a sports network, and when you look at what they're covering, there's so little of it that goes to women, and it's made me angry. But I also have to back up and think, like, but this is their audience, and this is what they've built. And so, it's going to take time to shift those things. And also, it's people like you and I and other niche publications that is helping to build this interest in women's sports more too. So, you know, it's a sea change that's coming, but it's not quite there yet.
Yeah. I think it's interesting with ESPN Sports because it sort of defines what sports is as,
Right.
hockey, football, baseball, basketball, all men. And I think that's a big problem with women's sports is because it doesn't include those things, or mostly doesn't include those things. But what does it include? What is women's sports? And I don't know. I mean, when I first started the podcast in 2016, so many of my athletes, none of them were slouches, are slouches, and so many of them said that they were not athletes, which I found completely fascinating. And I sort of let that go. It's changed a
Wow.
little bit, but I've recently been hearing more and more this conversation about women not considering themselves athletes because, they're not at the highest level. I mean, even somebody at World Championships this weekend, she was there, she had bike shorts on, she had a helmet strapped to her backpack. So obviously she had ridden to the event, and I know that it was up on a hill because I walked it every day. So to me, she's an athlete, and she said very specifically, "Oh, I'm not an athlete."
That's the way we use definitions of ourselves and others is very interesting, especially in the women's sports space.
Yeah,
And we can have a whole conversation
we sure
about
can.
that.
But
So,
maybe we should wrap it up here. It has been terrific talking to you this week. I'm Elizabeth from Hear Her Sports Podcast, and
eh,
I'm here with Cherie Turner from Strides Forward podcast.
Thank you so much.